Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It is humbling and it's a privilege really to talk with you today and just share a little bit of what Christ has been doing in my life and in my wife Keri's life. So James, thanks for the intro. As James said, I grew up in a Christian home. I had one sister, just under 1 year older than me. I was baptized as a baby, and in my upbringing, we did prioritize church. So I knew church was a 1 week Sunday attendance. I would say that I knew who God was, but I did not have a relationship with God. I attempted to read the Bible in my youth, the frontal assault, pretty common. I think I made it to maybe Deuteronomy before the second time, and I was like, I just don't understand what's going on. I can't do this. I was involved in sports. That was one of the defining things of my childhood. I played soccer for as long as I can remember. I kicked for the football team, wrestled, played baseball, and I would say that throughout, basically up through high school, I was defined by my academics. I strived to get good grades, and my achievements, really, just through sports. I graduated high school in '99, the big letter Bravo up there, the big B, Boonesboro High School in Maryland. I moved at that point to West Virginia University, and that was the first time moving away from home. And I would say that in the Bible, when you read the story of the prodigal son out of Luke 15, that was a pretty accurate portrayal of what took place as I left my parents' home and started making decisions on my own. So not having a relationship with Christ, essentially at that point, I started living in the world. I made a fake ID when I was 17 years old, used it to buy alcohol, made some of my friends fake IDs. I pursued women. I had issues with lust, with purity, and I was still defined by my own achievements. I was extremely self-absorbed. I graduated college in 2003 and started working full-time for an engineering firm that I had interned with throughout my college days in the summer and on breaks. So my plan was, I graduated, I was going to move back, live with my parents for a month, maybe two, earn enough money, work at a good job that I had to pay off my college loans, and immediately start life on my own as an adult. God had other plans, although I didn't know it at the time. My life was in turmoil. I was still searching for something, the next achievement to define who I was, or the next success. I basically, at that point, one of my good friends from high school joined the military when I went to college. He happened to be home doing recruiting duties in our hometown when I graduated, and he said, "Hey man, when you want a real job, come and talk to me." I was like, I got you, buddy. Like, I'm gonna work my engineering gig, and 30 days after I graduated, I went to my friend and I was like, "Nick, what do you got, man? I wanna fly." And so I ended up coming into the Army on a warrant officer flight. They call it street to seat or high school to flight school contract, basically where from when I entered service in October of 2003, I went through basic training, right down to Fort Rucker to Warrant Officer Candidate School, and right into flight school. So I kind of did the fast track as far as that goes. After I graduated from flight school, I was qualified to fly the UH-60 Black Hawk. I went to Japan and I completed a 3-year tour from 2005 to 2008. And I was still lost. The same characteristic traits, self-absorption, and just complete issues with who I was as I tried to seek activities and success to define who I was. I was still lost. I was on a volatile road leading to destruction. And as I continued to search for that purpose and that next achievement, I was like, I want to fly for the best aviation organization on the history of the planet, so I'm going to assess for the 160th. And so that's what I did. I'm like, that's my next achievement. So I went to Fort Campbell in January of 2008 and assessed for the 160th. I don't know how I convinced them to pick me up, but they said yes. And that started kind of my next journey. And essentially that was a journey exactly where God wanted me to be, because I completed about 6 months of training, went right to Fort Lewis, Washington. And within weeks of hitting the ground at Fort Lewis in late 2008, early 2009, I ran into Jamie Fisher. But before I get ahead of myself, I would say up until this point, if I had to characterize or summarize myself, I was defined by my achievements. I was defined by my job and my position within the military, and I was self-made. In my own mind, it was my hard work and it was my efforts that allowed me to be successful in the position that I was in. So I was entirely wrapped up in the world.
I grew up in a non-Christian home. My parents divorced when I was 15 years old. I went to college and poured myself into academics and work. I had 3 jobs while I was going to school full-time. I graduated in 2002 from a nursing school in Canada. I moved to Maryland in 2006. If I had to summarize my priorities from the time I moved to Maryland to finding Jesus, it was spent idolizing my career and time and money in alcohol, shopping, and pursuing men. In 2009, I hit rock bottom. I realized that I was trying to fill things and search for something, and I was still empty. And I knew that thing I was missing was probably God, but I still wasn't willing to give myself up to Him. I still wanted control of my life. In 2012, I started going to church. I was church shopping more for the people than what I was actually getting from the Word. Also in 2012, I met Brad and we became friends with his sister.
All right, so as I was saying, when I met Jamie, I didn't know why I got stationed at Fort Lewis and was flying Chinooks at this point. I transitioned out of the Black Hawk. And at the time, when we assessed, we could select the duty assignments within the 160th, rank them in order, and the airframes, rank them in order. And Fort Lewis was the bottom of the list, and so was Chinooks, and that's exactly where God wanted me to be. So, hindsight, I can see that God had me exactly where He wanted me to be, because I walked in to get my kit from our OCIE, which is basically like a Swoopy supply office. That I was getting my body armor and plates. Excuse me. And Jamie was there behind the counter, didn't know him at the time. He's like, "Hey, do you believe in Jesus?" Like, anybody that knows Jamie's like, "Yeah, that sounds like Jamie." At the time, I was like, well, I still considered, although I was not living as a Christian, I considered myself a Christian. And I said, yeah, I claim Jesus as my Lord and Savior. And he's like, hey, we have a Tuesday Bible study. He invited me out. Long and short of that, I started getting time with Jamie. You can see him there on that far left picture. That was when I went to see him when he was in Japan for a year, or correction, in Korea for a year. But that was my first look at someone who was intentionally seeking a relationship and who was actually living it out in their life. It wasn't just a professed faith, it was a lived out faith. And that was something that I found instantly, it attracted me to what he had and what this relationship was. And so through meeting with Jamie and getting man-to-mans, he started teaching me about how to get time with Jesus, how to read the Bible, not just the frontal assault, as I failed before, how to study the Scriptures, how to memorize the Scriptures. And I would say my eyes were open, similar to when Saul had the encounter with God and he was blinded. And then when Ananias touches him and the scales fell away from his eyes so he could see, I think that story out of Acts 9, it basically summarized how God used Jamie in my life to really just have the scales fall away and for me to start to prioritize Jesus. So that was really the first step in my transformation. I would say that at the time I was pretty discouraged. I felt as though I was a sinner beyond reach, that I had squandered my youth. I had made some extremely poor decisions and left kind of a wake of just failed relationships and hurt people along the way. But Paul's words in 1 Timothy 1, 15 and 16 was a verse that really stood out to me in my early quiet time. It says, "Here's a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. But that for that very reason I was shown mercy, so that in me, the worst of sinners, Christ Jesus might display His unlimited patience as an example for those who would believe on Him and receive eternal life." My transformation was not a overnight process. God had to refine my life, my decisions, my value system, and it took a while. My first attempt to read through the Bible in a year took about 22 months, as I lacked obedience to have a daily quiet time. But after that, things really picked up. I continued to stay in fellowship, which was pivotal, because I was in and out on deployments. I was gone between 180 and 240 days a year on different trips and TDYs. So I was basically in and out of the ministry consistently. So there were seasons of plenty and seasons of like the desert times, really, that I was being tested by. But throughout that time, I would say that men like Jamie, through Mike Chong, who I had the pleasure of living with during this pivotal transition point, him and Liz and their family, it was completely impacting on my life. Guys like Andrew Stroud, Steve McGee, Eric Abshire, Isaac Phones, and Luke Calvert, just to name a few, were all men who modeled a life seeking after Christ. And that was exactly what I needed at that time in my life. So through this time of refinement, God really put his finger on many issues in my life, from foul language, lust, pornography, pride, but one in particular was my dating life and purity. I realized that I had always idolized relationships, and that was an idol that I needed to give up. I ended a relationship and started to focus all my time and all my attention on my relationship with Jesus, and really investing in the community that God had given me so richly at Fort Lewis.
In January of 2013, Brad sent me a Bible and the Lewis 20 Studies TMS verse packs and told me I needed Jesus in my life. I started reading my Bible on a daily basis. I started going to church, and I started attending some Bible studies. They look very different from what I'm now doing amongst the Navigator ministry. My first Bible study was with a group of elderly men in my church. It was on discipleship, actually, but everyone else was over the age of 60 except for me. I also did another Bible study with some friends who were believers in Maryland as well. I was convinced after reading Matthew 7:21, not everyone who calls out to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Only those who actually do the will of my Father in heaven will enter. Shortly after this, I was baptized. In January of 14, Brad and I started dating, and we dated long distance. He continued to encourage me in my walk with Jesus, and I continued to be involved in Bible studies and in church. However, I was doing this on my own. I did not have a community. In August of 2014, I moved into the Navigator community at JBLM with Mike and Liz Chong, their 4 kids, and Jessica Abrams as my roommate. Up until this point, I was living on my own at the age of 34, moving into a house full of people, sharing bunk beds was a huge challenge. I recognized exactly how selfish I had become. God was able to teach me how to love one another well in this community. I started to see what it was like to share life and what following Christ looked like. In Luke 9:23, he was saying to them all, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. This is exactly what I was seeing in this community. It was something I'd never seen before. I started leading a small group, started reaching out to women in the community, and I started sharing life with those in the community as well.
All right, one thing I will say to the single guys out there, you have to marry up. And so God definitely blessed me with an amazing wife that has a heart for the Lord and a heart for the Lord's people. As we started our ministry together, it was trial and error. We had to figure out really what our capacity was to labor together. We had each been doing it independently, but now it took on a new form. We had to stretch our limits. We had to see what our capacity would be. Similar to knowing your 1 rep max in the gym, until you reach a point where you can't lift the weight anymore, you don't really know what you're capable of doing. And so that's pretty much how we started to attack ministry as a couple. We did everything we could think of. We hosted dinners, anything from inviting one person, married couples, and large groups, pretty much everything in between. Of note, we did host a Christmas party that had over, I think, 45 people in our home. Which, if there was a fire marshal around, we may have been fined for that. But in any case, so we really tried to test new things out and see what works. We hosted game nights. My wife would host baby showers. We did Bible study, prayer, and we're still all the while focusing on individual relationships via man-to-man and man-to-mans. For the single guys out there, I have found that it's much easier to recruit men to your home, particularly when you have a wife that's capable of cooking a home-cooked meal for them. So as you're marrying up, find someone who can cook well. But God really taught us many lessons through this season of life. And one big one was time management. I think, as Doug shared on briefly last night, we definitely found that was a point that we really had to work through together. We both had full-time jobs. We were heavily involved in ministry and inviting people into our lives. and we needed to steward the resource of time well. We shared, as simple as this sounds, a shared Google Calendar was a huge tool that we used to start to synchronize and manage our life together. It's basic, but it really enabled us as I was jumping around from continent to continent, home, and then back again, to really synchronize and keep a track so I could pray for my wife when I wasn't there, know who she's meeting with for women and women's, etc. So it was truly impactful in our relationship. We focused on, at a minimum, weekly conversations and prayer for the people that we're trying to reach and how we could best encourage those people in their walk with Jesus as we continue to seek him. We had to learn how to say no, and for Keri and I, we're both servants by nature, and so that was extremely difficult. Really the choice was, are we going to spread ourselves a mile wide and go an inch deep, or were we going to look at Jesus' model and try to go deep with a few key people and really go for impact and not for breadth, if that makes sense. This is still a work in progress, and we are learning and really leaning on God to continue to lead us in this area.
So Brad and I have been praying for a couple that would live close to us that we could invest in. And for those of you that know about the communal living that's happening in DuPont, Washington, we actually live in Lacey, Washington. So there weren't many people around us. God answered our prayers by moving the Flynns in down the street. I met Amy while I was visiting Brad at Fort Rucker in the summer of 2016. Sean and Amy and their 3 kids were getting ready to move to Fort Lewis. Amy and I stayed in contact for 6 months. She said I was relentless in this process. I encouraged them and finally convinced them to move in down the street. Brad and I started sharing life with the Flynns and helping them grow in their walk with Jesus. We invited them into our lives, having weekly dinners, being intentional with time, meeting up for quiet times, man-to-mans, ma'am-to-mams, and leading small groups. Sean and Brad happened to be deployed at the same time and were able to encourage each other via phone calls and the occasional meal and lots of prayer. Amy and I also continued to encourage each other during this. Sean was deployed much longer than Brad. However, we both experienced lots of trials and tribulations in this period. Amy and I continued to encourage, love, and support each other during this time, as well through accountability, dinners, sharing life events, and those trials that we had. In 1 Thessalonians 5:11, it says, "Therefore encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact as you are doing." It's been amazing to see them grow in their knowledge and obedience to Christ, and to see them share their faith with the next generation that's coming alongside of them. Also, most recently, we have decided to move in a single woman from the ministry, Alyssa Heigenberger. She moved in a couple months ago so we can share our life with her. We met Alyssa in 2016 at a social event with another Bible study group in the area. I had invited Alyssa out to join the military community Navigator Bible study, and she's a civilian, and she took that like a champ. And as you know, the military can be intimidating if you're not part of it. So she came into the community. She started coming out actually initially to some community dinners and family night dinners, and then out to Tuesday night outreach studies. Brad and I are excited to see what God is going to be doing in our life and what he's going to teach us in this process and how we will grow in him.
Before we click to this next slide, I just want to intro it. One of the only things that we can fully control in our lives is our response or our reaction to things as they happen around us. And so prior to my last deployment, my wife and I had a long conversation of 2 things that now stand out above all the rest that we discussed. The first one was, what would life look like if I took another job within the battalion and slowed down a little bit? And the second one was, what would I do if I wasn't able to fly again? I don't know how we got on those topics, but we did before the deployment. So although we didn't necessarily realize it, God was so faithful and prepared both Keri and I for a life-changing experience. Psalm 86, verse 15 says, "But you, O Lord, are a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness." The end of October in 2017, I was involved in a helicopter crash while I was deployed outside the continental U.S. The picture there on the left was taken about 6 days after the event. It's not a bad news story. It's actually quite the opposite. There was tragedy involved, but Keri and I have experienced the Lord really in an incredible way since this night. The event itself, it was a miracle that really anyone walked away. And not only myself, but 5 other crew members survived. My co-pilot, who sat 2 foot to my right-hand side, unfortunately lost his life in the accident. I chose to fly with Jake on the deployment, really for, for one primary reason. I thought that he was an atheist, and I really wanted to share Christ with him. And so prior to this night, I was able to have multiple conversations. I was able to have multiple conversations with Jake. And some of what we talked about, I was able to share with his wife, which I think really gave her a peace when I made it back. When Keri heard about this accident, the community of believers at Fort Lewis came together and they displayed love in a palpable way. And I say that because our neighbors who lived across the street, who we were also reaching out to, but never really fully invested or committed to the NAV community, when they saw the people pouring into my wife, she just wanted to be around the people that were gathering, just to be there. It was really incredible to see, from what I've heard, obviously. So, the pictures on the right here are just a few. I have hundreds and missed some people along the way, but those are people that came to visit Keri and I during the 4 months that we had after the crash at Walter Reed. And it was amazing. We had to get a separate Google Calendar just to keep track of all the people as they were coming and going. It was literally that crazy. Like, there was probably no more than 2 or 3 days that we didn't have a visitor or people staying with us at the when we got out of the hospital and stayed in a small apartment. During this time, our ministry really shifted from what we knew at Fort Lewis to sharing Jesus with the nurse who was taking care of me at Walter Reed, or a clinical psychologist in particular, who was puzzled why we were both so happy, given the laundry list of injuries that I had, which I'm not going to bore you with, and the fact that I had permanently lost vision in my right eye. As a pilot, is kind of a bad deal. And so she wouldn't let us leave the hospital until we sat down and talked with her. So what an opportunity to share Christ and what he's done in my life with someone that may not have known Jesus for herself. I witnessed God use a tragedy and really brought himself glory in more ways than I have time to go through right now. But it was my consuming prayer as I regained consciousness after the accident itself.
One of my initial prayers when I first heard about Brad's crash was that we would remain in fellowship during this recovery process. Being a nurse, I knew that we were going to be there months. I actually had anticipated much longer than 4 months. So God answered our prayers. 3 days after I prayed this, I received a message from Steve and Ashley Smith, who were living in Singapore, and said, "Hey, guess what? We're headed back to Washington, D.C., and we'll be there in 6 weeks." This happened to coincide with Brad starting his outpatient treatment at Walter Reed, which led us to be able to drive to the Smith's house in Virginia once a week to do in-depth Bible study and encourage each other in our walks with Jesus as we were both sort of navigating a new harvest field. Also, he introduced us to another Navigator couple, Nate and Lisa Hines, who are currently here. And they were coming to Walter Reed for some treatment as well. We had never met them. However, we would meet for prayer, meals, and encouragement. And from the first time we met them in the hospital room, from they walked in the door, it was like they were family to us, even though we hadn't met them.
So I know we're a little bit over on time, but just a couple main points I want to leave you with. We've been kind of living this for the past 10 months since it happened at the end of October, and just want to share these last few big takeaways with you. Job 14:5 says, "Man's days are determined. You have decreed the number of his months and have set limits he cannot exceed." Our days are numbered, so don't miss an opportunity to share Christ with someone. You really never know when it's going to be your last opportunity. God answers prayers. I know that it was the hand of God that saved me in the crash. If I went through all the details of it, you would also get that same outcome from the conversation. It was the hand of God by far, and the prayers of the saints that allowed Christ's power just to work so strongly in the situation. I know many people here heard about the accident and prayed for me, and I do thank you from the bottom of my heart. Me standing here today is a physical miracle of God's answered prayer. God is faithful. in ways that we can't comprehend or even imagine. Lamentations 3, 22 and 23 is a verse many of us know. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And the last point I want to leave you with today is prepare for the storm. As Doug shared last night, it may not be early in your life, it may not happen, but the refining test of the storm coming into your life will show the quality of the construction that you built with, and whether you built on the sand or on the rock of Christ. Although we didn't know it, our individual and joint reliance and devotion to Jesus and our community of believers was built before the storm rolled in, and that's made a huge difference. 2 Timothy 4:2 is a verse I'll leave you with. Preach the word. Be prepared in season and out of season. Correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction. Thank you all.